welcome to Straight Talk Live. I am one of your hosts, Rick Snyder. I am the CEO of Invisible Edge, the author of Decisive Intuition, and head of culture at Refound. And very excited for this show today. This is our nonprofit where we get to explore the conversations that we need to be talking about in a post-COVID climate when it comes to human transformation, digital transformation, social impact. And I'm very excited for this show in particular about the state of the media and the state of journalism today. And really that touches on all those three areas. But first, I want to hand it off to my co-host, Af Malhotra. Af, take it away.
Thank you, Rick. Welcome everyone for another fantastic Straight Talk Live session. I'm the co-creator of Straight Talk Live and of course the co-host and also the co-founder of Growth Enabler, and delighted to have a wonderful guest on a topic that is worrying us, it's plaguing us, and it's taking a lot of our attention, ironically. So Rick, back to you and let's crack on.
Okay. So as we all know, this whole term around fake news has really, lit up around the world. And it's gotten to a point where it's true. Like, we don't know what's accurate, what's real, what can we trust? Anyone can make news these days on any video recorder and or a written piece around the world and can have it under a certain banner. And we don't know what's legitimate anymore. And there's so many ways it can get manipulated. So we have with us an amazing journalist and correspondent, Ryan Chilcote. So Ryan, welcome to Straight Talk Live.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be with the two of you.
Thank you. And very excited about this topic because so many of us are struggling with all the information we're subjected to. What can we really trust? How do we get more informed and more smart about how we consume information? Where should be our go-to places? And what is the state of journalism? So just want to give a little background on you. We know that you've worked with the PBS NewsHour, CBS, Bloomberg TV, CNN. You've been a correspondent in the heart of different war zones like Chechnya, Afghanistan, and Russia. So you're like the Indiana Jones of news correspondence, I think. So
it was a good way to grow up. Yeah.
Could you share a little bit more about your background and how you got there and just a little taste for our audience?
Sure. So I went to university in California. That was in the early 90s. I was a big fan of CNN and I was a big fan of Russia. I was a Russian studies major. And I thought, well, I obviously should go to Russia and work for CNN. So I flew out to Atlanta the day I graduated or the day after. And I said, hey, I'm the best thing since sliced bread. You need to hire me in Moscow. And there was a guy named Steve Cassie at the time running the international desk. He said, whoa, son, have a seat, slow down. Why don't you go over to Russia? And our millennials in the audience won't understand this, but he said, give us a collect call. And that was his big bone to me was he basically was giving me an expense-free call. CNN was going to pay for the call once I got to Moscow to discuss an internship. So I went to Moscow, made my collect call through AT&T at the time. And I said, Steve, I'm here. You promised me a job. And he said, no, I promised you an internship or to discuss an internship. Well, it turned out that because I'd already graduated from university, he technically couldn't give me an internship, but we found a way, and I started interning for CNN back in 1995. There was a lot going on in Russia at the time. It was always, is Yeltsin dead, alive, drunk, dancing, throwing nuclear bombs around the world, and it was a very unstable time. The second war in Chechnya was underway. Or rather, the first war in Chechnya was underway. So I caught the tail end of that, the whole of the first one, or rather the second one. And I went from being an intern to being an associate producer, to being a producer, to being a producer. They occasionally let report, to being a reporter. I covered all of the former Soviet Union. I like to refer to it as aggressive travel. I went all around the former Soviet Union, all around Russia, from the sort of Far East Russian border with North Korea right up to the Kola Peninsula and into the Arctic Circle. And I also covered some of the war zones. Something you do if you're sitting in a bureau when things get quiet. So I spent some quality time in Afghanistan immediately following September 11. I arrived in northern Afghanistan on September 14th, 2001. And I spent quite a bit of time in Iraq. I went to Kuwait before the war started, sort of got my timing wrong, showed up in Kuwait a little early, ended up spending 4 or 5 months between Kuwait and then Iraq during the initial invasion, and then went back for 5, 6 more trips. So spent a good couple of years of my life off and on in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the balance in Russia and the former Soviet Union, living in Moscow. And then in 2007, I got this crazy proposal at a cocktail party where I'd already had a little too much to drink from this guy who said, "Hey, how'd you like to do business news, financial news? I work for Bloomberg TV. We'd love to hire you." And I'd never heard of Bloomberg TV, and I had no idea what financial news was or is. But I thought, wow, London, that sounds pretty good. They speak English in London. It's a nice place to go, and it's still international, right? So I get to continue my, as you said, Indiana Jones adventure. So I rocked up in London, and it turned out that business news, generally speaking, is a bit drier than going to war zones. But luckily for me, unluckily for the world, within weeks we were in the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, and things got really dramatic very quickly. And I learned to really love business and finance news, and think that actually it's quite a privilege to engage in it. It's a bit more challenging in a lot of ways than, being in a war zone with exciting things going on around you and dramatic things going on. And so I did that until just 2016, 2017. And now, as you correctly pointed out, I freelance. I work with the PBS NewsHour, other news organizations. I've worked with CBS in the past, on a sort of gig by gig basis.
So let's go right there. Let's do some straight talk, because I love that you're a freelancer, so you're not beholden to any organization.
Sure,
you can speak freely about your experience, or all of them. And so let me ask you this. What's your honest take about how journalism was when you were growing up in the ranks and people had to fact check things? There were editors that were, very fastidious about that. At the same time, it wasn't as politicized, I think, as you see a lot of news outlets now, where it's clear who's right-leaning, left-leaning, those kind of things. What changes have you seen in the industry from when you started to what you see right now?
Well, there's definitely a lot more opinion, right? That's a good place to start. So when I was taught to be a journalist, and I was literally taught on the job, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. This was, back in the mid 90s. I was always taught that my opinion is irrelevant, and I should never share it with anyone. So thankfully, at the time, there were things like Twitter or other social media. So I didn't feel compelled to, discuss the news in that kind of environment. I either appeared on TV and, during doing a live shot, or maybe I was writing a CNN.com article, but it was either hard facts, or it was what we used to call a reporter's notebook, which was a little sort of experiential, where I kind of brought my own little personal take, but not my personal opinion. And whatever let's say if I was doing a news package, a sort of sound on tape recorded, you've seen them, the reports, as opposed to live, then every single word would get vetted by what was called the Row, a group of assignment editors led by some really extraordinary journalists who would, take your script, and sometimes they'd say, "That looks fantastic, go for it." And other times would look at it and scratch their head and say, "Yeah, I actually don't even really think you have a story here." So anything in between, they could completely reject it because they felt like you just hadn't produced journalism, or they could, just help you massage the story to make it more clear, less biased. Maybe you were, missing the other side. I do see nowadays some news organizations don't do what script approval, what that process is called. And obviously, I could not help but notice that when you watch television in the United States, I'm sitting in London, but I still see a lot of U.S. news, even as I participated in. I'm also a consumer of it. There's a lot of opinion out there, not to mention we're not even talking about social media. So things have definitely changed.
Do you think it's fascinating for those of us who've not been in journalism that you come from a world where your opinion was irrelevant?
Yes.
It almost sounds like some surreal description of what media would be in the past, because today, of course, everyone seems to have an opinion, and of course, everyone seems to have a device of some sort to share that opinion as loudly, as brashly, or as articulately as they wish, which has been one of the big problems around the confusion and the dilution of what one thinks is the kind of accurate versus inaccurate, real versus fake. Talk to us about, you've talked to us about yesterday, talk to us about today. What's changed?
Well, I mean, one thing I'll tell you, and I don't mean to be disingenuous in saying this, is I'd like to think that I got so good at, I always had an opinion, particularly in the beginning I had an opinion, but I got so good at suppressing my opinion, or at least I'd like to think I got so good at suppressing my opinion that I didn't share it. So, and after a while, I stopped having an opinion. Now that might be not a good thing. So not only was I not sharing it, but I genuinely really didn't have one, because I kind of just got into this state where you share what's happening, and I mean, the way you sort of, I was in Russia, right? Very different view on things, and the way you get to get people to share that view with you is to basically shut up and listen to them. And what you don't get is if you tell them what you think, generally speaking, you don't end up sort of learning a whole lot. You end up in an argument. So that's different than, how things are nowadays. I feel like people do share their opinion. I feel like it's different now, though. It's harder now. So I don't really want to judge my colleagues that engage in this. I think we should all recognize that there are people in the news, and usually they're kind of well identified, that are kind of pundits, right? That's their thing. They're columnists. Their job is to share their views. And then they're, even within the same news organizations, journalists, reporters, whose job is to tell you the facts. And I'm not even sure that even when the journalists are not telling you the facts, that's a terrible thing. Because if you think about the situation in the United States, this whole like kind of thing where, this side says X and the other side says Y. If you know that X is a lie, then maybe you should be able to say it's a lie, right? We were taught no, right? That you just say what X is, and maybe you later in the story sort of lay out the issues with that. But we didn't get engaged in the sort of a process of sort of editorializing. We would include the other side, the opposing view, where they said it's a lie. But I mean, things have changed a lot, and I think the media, became in the United States part of the news. Everybody started talking about the media. This is an uncomfortable place for the media to be. That wasn't the case in the 90s in the United States. It was the case in Russia in the 90s and early 2000s. So when I came to the States in, let's say, 2015, 16, 17, and everybody was like, oh my goodness, I remember this producer at a big US news channel telling me, my journalists, they're so frazzled. They're getting attacked day in and day out. I got to do something for them, help them. I was like, God, I wish my editors had felt like that, because that was constantly the relationship in the field for international correspondents in huge swaths of the world. So I didn't have any like sort of, I guess this is wrong to say, but I didn't have any sort of compassion for those journalists, because I was like, hey, get used to it. That suck it up. That's how it works. You're not supposed to be friends with the people that you're covering.
That's fascinating. Do you think this piece around it almost feels like you created a habit of not saying what you think?
Yeah.
And it almost feels a little bit like you were like the objective correspondent who had to look at both. I was trying
to be. We all have, as is so, popular to talk about these days, we all have sort of our own prejudice that we're maybe not even aware of. And, we would certainly, I get called out on that. Like say by the Russians, the Russians, I would always say to me in the 90s, I thought it was so novel. They assumed that CNN was CIA TV, right? we worked for the US government, that I was, right up until even just, a few years ago, good friends of mine or good sources of mine would just assume that I was kind of an arm of the US government. And I'd be like, no, really, that they've never told me what to say. I don't even talk to them. I don't see them. They're nowhere in the process. But it is true that if you think about CNN, for example, reporters that work for CNN, because it's a U.S. and an international channel, they have CNNI, but if you think about the U.S. channel, they generally are Americans. They generally have an American worldview. They're generally interested in what the U.S. government is saying about things, and things do go through that prism a little bit.
I want to ask you about this. One of the things we've touched on in other previous episodes is this idea of controlling the narrative and how much power that is when media, for example, is one of the biggest arms of being able to control a narrative and then, of course, distribute that in mass, right?
Yeah.
And so it's incredibly powerful. And maybe now we're more impacted by that than ever with social media and internet and TV. And like we're constantly bombarded by input. And so if you control the narrative, you win, even if the narrative is not based in facts and truth, right? You can manipulate that.
Maybe there is something to that. Because if you think about it, when I started in the news business in the sort of mid 90s, right? We were just learning email. I mean, that it was 1995. I saw my first cell phone. It was a big Motorola flip phone, and it heated up when you held it. And
probably give you some brain
social media. So we had the exclusive rights when it came to we were the arbiters of truth.
Right.
We had an exclusive right to distribute the news. I was working for CNN. Where else were you going to get it? You were going to get it on the networks. NBC, ABC, CBS had hour-long nightly newscasts, morning newscasts, and then there were the newspapers, and that was it. But now, obviously, if you have a Twitter account and you tweet a lot, and you can not only create, but you can distribute. And journalists have lost that sort of exclusive position. And if you say things often enough, that people like to hear, you can develop a following, and that can be really powerful. And that person doesn't have to even ever come to listen to me on CNN, for example.
What about the elements of specialism and expertise and training? You would imagine when you were doing what you were doing, and there's a whole generation of journalists in during your time and before. And this is we have different listeners, right? Different age groups. So not everyone will connect with what happened 25 years ago. Some younger listeners, and we've got those around the block. So what are your views on, and we'll come to the narrative in a second and bias and so on. What are your views on specialism? Like the two examples, the Twitter person and you have, the idea of ethics, risk, responsibility,
Yeah, well, this is where I always feel like every time I say this, I'm like the grumpy old guy, right? I feel like expertise is not valued anymore. I consider myself to be a Russia expert, for example. I've been going to Russia since 1990. That's 30 years. There are hundreds I discovered during the Russiagate story and the investigation in Russia, hundreds of Russia experts, right? Who have never been to Russia, who don't speak Russian, who don't know anyone in Russia. And I think, in the TV space, let's face it, broadcast television isn't just about knowledge and expertise, being an expert. It's also about sounding good, being fluent, looking good, being representative of your audience. And so I do feel that that's been lost a little bit in general, right across the media space, the true sort of expertise. Everybody seems to be really quick to think that they know what they're talking about. Whereas I think, many of us, the older we get, think we, sort of maybe realize or at least believe that we don't really know very much at all, but maybe relative to other people, we have something to share.
Do you think, what if you were to pinpoint on one factor or driver or trend that's made that happen? Would you, like, for example, a lot of people say, I'd blame social media, because Facebook was used during the Arab Spring. People said, well, don't believe them, don't believe CNN, or don't believe Fox, or don't believe the BBC. Actually, I'm going to tell you the story from the ground. And it was a very powerful way for all of us around the world to try and really truly understand what's going on in an extreme situation, a war-torn country, and so on. Do you think that's been the real disruptor of the world you're talking about of the past? It's social media, or is it something else?
Social media is definitely part of it. Maybe it's not the only thing. There is a focus even in traditional media on cost, on sort of vibrancy of it's a tough. There are many more talented people that could do the job of, let's say, TV reporters than there are spots. Sometimes I feel like some of the other constituent parts to the in the magic sauce that have the other ingredients, they win out. So I'm not sure it's just social media, but let me continue to think about that as we speak.
When you draw on your different experiences like PBS, CBS, Bloomberg, CNN, and you have quite a diverse group of experiences, and probably a lot of different freelance experiences you've had beyond that as well. What's been your experience in terms of where you feel like you have freedom to tell the story, you're not going to be censored, versus times where you're totally having to fit into their narrative? What's your experience on that range of what that's been like for you as a journalist? And curious to hear.
Nah, you're going to make me choose favorites here. Yeah. Look, I will say this, big bone to PBS. I think PBS takes a lot longer, gives reporters more time to tell complex stories, and is prepared to, they used to, I don't know if this is true. This is like myth, right? But urban myth, but they apparently used to say, dare to bore. Right. The element of entertaining people as part of the news business is really not a high priority at PBS. It's about getting the story right, helping people understand it, taking 5, 6, 7 minutes to do that. You will not see that in regular broadcast newscasts very often, because they've got a half an hour, an hour. So I have felt, and this is with all the respect in the world of CBS, some of the most amazing journalists work at CBS. It's a bit clipped sometimes. And also I would say sometimes it feels a little tendentious, a little, let's hype it up. Let's make it really dramatic, or even when it's supposed to be raw, let's make it raw. Let's create raw. Let's not just do raw. Let's practice raw so that it looks raw. And I just feel that, that would be true of all of the networks. I feel like there's this emphasis to wow, because you're fighting for attention. Where so often things are a little more nuanced.
In fact, Shannon in our audience is asking a question on this very issue right here. She says,
I hope you don't work for CBS, Shannon. I'd love a job.
She says, no, Fox News. No, I'm just kidding. She asks, have you ever felt...
I will say in Fox News, I know everybody likes to pick on Fox News. I think that Fox News reporters, and I occasionally work with Fox, I think Fox News reporters in the field tell it like they see it. I don't think that there is bias coming from the reporters. I think, they got a lot of talk shows where there are people that are sharing their, they're more pundits.
And so here's what Shannon wants to ask you is, have you ever felt pressured to produce more sensational content?
Yes. That was getting to my point. Yes.
Yep. So you have felt pressured for that.
Yeah, I have. Yes. 100%. Not to lie, but to, sort of build something up, be a little bit more sensationalist than necessary, I mean, you think about, I cover Russia, right? Russia's like the big bogeyman, right? I'm not giving anybody a pass here, But so I think news editors, like everybody else on this planet, are given to quick fixes, and like, oh well, it's like a cookie cutter. Oh, like, well, so Russia, we know this is our perception of Russia, so it must be this. I was reading this tweet the other day. It was, and I was just like, what the heck? Like, they were, it had something to do with the Russiagate, right? Mm-hmm. And the guy, it was an exchange between two smart reporters in Washington, D.C. And one of the reporters said, yeah, Russia's great, but, they also during World War II went around and raped people during after they liberated Berlin. I thought, geez, what a strange thing that they were discussing, something about, sort of 2020
from 80 years ago
taking place 2020, and now we're back in 1940, what, 44, right. 43. Yeah. And I thought, geez,
but isn't
has this individual ever been to Russia? How relevant is that?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
I don't know. I haven't seen the statistics. I'm sure Soviet troops weren't great, but that doesn't mean that they didn't play a role in helping to liberate, a good chunk of Europe. And I don't know that all American troops always acted with 100% honor. I assume they do. I give them the benefit of the doubt. I spent a lot of time covering U.S. troops, but it just felt a little bit of a kind of nationalistic, jingoistic, patriotic, odd thing for a reporter to say.
So given that, let's talk about there are quite a few questions that are coming in. So we're not going to wait till the end because we're going to go through all sorts of topics. So yeah. Bill's got a bunch of questions. I'm trying to work out which one to ask first. I'll go with the most recent one, which is an interesting one. So what impact do you believe the overwhelming left-wing ideology embraced by the vast majority of professional journalists, editorial staff, management has on the objectivity and credibility of the media?
Okay. Fair question. On LinkedIn, before we did this, I did, one of the things that you raised that we were going to discuss is how journalist credibility is under fire. Distrust of journalists is under fire. I notice it's particularly under fire amongst conservatives. Liberal, more left-leaning people are more likely to trust the media, according to the poll that I shared on our LinkedIn conversation there, than right-leaning Americans, which I find interesting. Look, I don't know if all journalists are leftists. What I do know is it's probably true that there is an underrepresentation of right-leaning people amongst journalists. I think there is something to that. And I don't think it's like a conspiracy but I do think that some of the conservative values that many of my good friends have outside of the media don't seem to be as prevalent, sort of represented as prevalently inside the media as outside. But remind me the latter half of that question.
Yeah. So the latter half was. Let me read the question again. So what impact do you believe the overwhelming left-wing ideology embraced by the vast majority of professional journalists, staff, management has on the objectivity and credibility of the media?
Objectivity, credibility. So I think all journalists, the vast majority of journalists, let's put it this way, are all well-intentioned. They are doing their job. They work very hard. They don't get paid a lot of money. You have to put it in the perspective of, they are coming. How can I say this without tripping over myself here? I think they. I am tripping over myself. There we go. I think that. There is a kind of life experience issue, which does hurt the media a little bit. I think journalism is a calling. It tends to be a career, and people who are journalists tend to do that. That's been it. That's always the way it's been. They're kind of chronicling what's going on, and as a result, maybe they don't get the mix in with, maybe they've never had another job other than being a journalist, but they try and be honest. But I think that because there are some people that feel like their values aren't represented by the people they're watching. I feel like this is like the whole conversation in the United States. Journalists are just like part and parcel of a larger issue in the United States, where a lot of people in the U.S., it feels like, if you think about our election, it's turned into this kind of culture war, right? Where people on the right feel that people on the left are dictating how they should behave. And journalists have just been put in that camp on the left, but that's not really fair and not really true. So I think that the perceptions that journalists are part of that agenda has not helped journalists, but I don't really believe that is their agenda.
Bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy thing going on here as well.
Yeah, that wasn't a very good answer, but maybe I'll ask.
I get it. You get branded, you get tagged, and so on. Can we ask a few more questions, Rick? Yeah,
sure. Go for it.
That have come in.
Yep.
So one is, and I'll keep moving around because different people are asking different questions. One in from Facebook, because we're broadcasting on multiple social media channels.
Yeah.
One from FB, Rajan Shagunshi. Do you think the dilution of real journalism is because of too many players allowed in the market who are creating this new form of competition? And is this itself therefore posing a dilemma of control on journalism and its landscape and I guess its future?
The so many players, is that diluting real
journalism? Yeah. I think this also relates back to a sort of new types of journalism, sensational journalism that you see in different parts of the world. You certainly see it in the States. I'm not sure about the UK. I don't think we're culturally as sensational, but I do see it in parts of India, for example, as classic breaking news, sort of mentality. But I think this gentleman's saying, what is your view on that? You think?
So I kind of feel like we sort of talked about that a little bit earlier. Let me talk about a different issue, which I think is happening in the United States. Was that an American asking that question?
I think he's a Brit.
Okay. What in American news, and we've talked about this before, right? What we have seen is the whole story for the last 4 years has been Washington, D.C. Yeah. Right. It's been inside the Beltway politics. And I feel like that has not been helpful. It's this partisan, he says, she says, and we're not really seeing real people. It's just been these politicians lobbying kind of insults and criticism at one another. There's an extraordinary amount of very high quality journalism happening. But the bandwidth for it over the last 4 years has been infinitesimally small, because the biggest story in the world, not just in the United States, but the biggest story in the world was in Washington, D.C. for the last 4 years. So I think if you continue to watch the news, right, particularly as we move out of this pandemic, the mosaic of sophisticated, deep reporting, it's going to come back into frame over the next year or so. And I think we're all going to enjoy in that. I think it's just that it was just this blip in time where it became, Republicans versus Democrats, and that was the sort of the extent of the news that was reaching everyone in the world.
Ryan, on that note, let me just share a quick slide for you here, and we just chatted about this briefly. So this is coming from an independent source that's rating. It's called Ad Fontes Media, and they're trying to rate out of all the media outlets out there, which ones are more neutral, which ones skew left or right, and also which ones are more based in fact versus fiction, and made up opinion and what have you. Right. And so you'll see in this, what scores pretty much in the center are things like The Economist. BBC actually scored pretty well. AP Reuters is usually up there on top of the class. As far as being not so biased. Then you get CNN on the far left. Fox News is on the far right, although on this diagram it's not on here, but it's on a different one they have. Okay. So you just see some different possibilities here. And then you also see fiction towards the bottom and more fact as we go higher up.
So I'll tell you what I think about this. So I'm delighted that AP and Reuters are in the middle. So for our viewers that don't know, those are the Associated Press and Reuters are news agencies. And unfortunately, perhaps 80% of what you hear maybe that's an overstatement, but a huge chunk of the information that's being shared with you on all of these other platforms is coming from the Associated Press and Reuters. It is journalists retelling their reporting. It happens all the time. When you turn on the news, you often, many reporters have their own sourcing, original reporting. A lot of times they're just leaning on, copy the news stories of the Associated Press and Reuters. So it's wonderful that they're in the middle, right? NPR, I personally, I'm going to say something contrarian, find that a little bit surprising. When I was in the United States, I heard a 60-second, we're going to put my personal politics aside. I don't think they would shock anyone, but maybe this, considering if you tried to guess what my personal politics are, this might come as a little bit of a surprise. I thought NPR was not as objective as it could have been. In this one particular story I was listening to. They had a soundbite from the Democrats attacking the Republicans. There was a story about how, the story was about how, and this was going back, maybe this was in August, the two sides were unable to agree on financial relief for Americans, the Republicans and Democrats. And it started with, this sort of the reporter saying that they're unable to agree. And then there was a soundbite from the Democratic leadership saying, this is the Republicans, they don't want to help you. And then the reporter said that the Republicans see it differently. And there was no soundbite from the Republicans. And I thought,
it's not balanced.
When an editor should have stepped in and said, we should have a soundbite from the Republicans, right? X, Y, anyway.
Yes.
But NPR, generally speaking, does incredible in-depth reporting, and I'm a huge fan. And I already talked about the others. I think, like, for example, at all of these places, like if you talk about broadcast media, usually the reporters are doing their best to give you balanced news. If you think there's bias, it's usually on the talk shows.
So my main question for you in this is, and you'll see more reliable scored higher up, less reliable are the ones in the bottom. Here's my question is, what do you think the media needs to do to regain credibility in terms of less bias, more fact, more reporting, the real story, and letting you interpret as you will? Do you have any sense of what needs to change in the industry?
Jeez.
We ask light questions here on Straight Talk Live.
Yeah. So what needs to change in the industry? We need more on the ground reporting. We need more reporting that doesn't have to do expressly with politics. If you think about the United States, a huge amount of what's going on in the U.S. has nothing to do with Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is an expression of it. It's happening in Montana. The news is in Montana. The news is in California and in Boston. So one way is more original reporting, actually doing what TV is supposed to do, taking people places that they can't get to in their home. What could be more important when we're all stuck at home during the pandemic? If there was one thing, I think that would be it. Less talk, more show.
There's a whole bunch of questions coming in, so I'm going to try and interpret all of them. I think there's a big push towards trying to unpack social media related journalists. And I think that plays to ego, that plays to the personal brand of the journalist, it plays to sensationalism because that sells, right? You go on your Twitter, your Facebook, your Insta, and people are used to these short pieces. And it kind of almost goes against what you said earlier on, which was detailed investigations. Like in the UK, we have this thing called panorama reports. You really get, as you know, you get into details, you fact check, it's objective and it's pleasurable content. But I think
the thing about like Twitter to that point is that it's a little bit. So I worked at Bloomberg Television for a really long time, and Bloomberg TV is just the televised form of the Bloomberg terminal, really, right? Which is basically gives financial professionals around the world their news. And there's just loads of news on it. It's supposed to be the Cadillac of sort of information providers for for bankers, really, right? And so everything a banker needs to know should be on there. And there's lots of in-depth stories. The truth is that very few people read the in-depth stories. Almost all bankers read the one-line updates, the incremental developments. Twitter's great for that. if you have a great background on something and you don't need to read 13 pages because you already know 12 and a half of them, right? I mean, we all enjoy some nice narrative and stuff, but you know that. So you're just looking for what changed today. What infinitesimally small development was there that will change my view of something? I think Twitter is useful for that, but the context, I mean, come on, it's almost never there, right? I mean, people, and even if it is there, people don't dig that deep, right? I mean, how many times, I'm to blame, have you retweeted a story without reading the story you were retweeting just because you agreed with the headline?
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Well, and I think there's another question around this, which is specifically related to headlines. So, there's a piece around ethics. So what are Ryan's views on the ethics on sensationalism today when headlines don't always reflect the true content of the article? And headlines are used as clickbait rather than a fair representation of the article.
Yeah, I think it's lame. I think it's a shame. If there's one area where you really see the editorialization, the sort of partisanship, the opinion coming into news, it's in headlines. It's quite frankly shocking sometimes when you read, they're just like totally infused. And I guess it's because, they know their audience, right? But what I'll say, Af, is in the UK, right? So we saw the BBC and stuff like that. It's kind of being neutral arbiters, but also, one thing that's different maybe about how the US used to be, and how the UK is now is, it's not unusual for a news organization to have a kind of political orientation in the UK. That was unusual in the past in the United States, to have a pronounced political orientation. Yeah. And so the answer to some of these problems is get your news from more than one source. And that way you get to, hear different viewpoints.
Yeah. There's a note from someone who says, Ryan, the BBC is not neutral anymore.
Yeah, I know a lot of people think that. And, I'm not going to jump in on that debate because that's just, we'll be here for hours.
Right. So Chaz, who's in the UK as well, he says basically, I also worked in Russia for 10 years in the 90s as an economist. And he wants to ask you, Ryan, how can you continue to write about Russia in the current anti-Russian sentiment that's out there today?
Yeah, I know, because it's almost like you're almost like a bad guy for reporting Russia from Russia, right? I a lot of times feel like I'm like a Russia apologist, which is I'm not. A Putin apologist. Russia has become Putin. Putin has become Russia. When you talk about Russia, you're talking about what you think about Putin, not a country of 144 million people. So the question is, again,
basically, how can you keep reporting on Russia amidst the backdrop of an anti-Russian sentiment? How do you bring your voice forward in effective ways when that's still happening in the space?
Yeah, it's tough, because if you think about like the Russia investigation, right? All of the news was coming out of the United States and out of DC. The Russians, unsurprisingly, were not sharing any any insight as to what they were doing in terms of meddling in the election. And so, all of the Russia experts, all of a sudden, all the news about Russia and what Russia had been up to was coming out of, maybe Maryland, but mostly Washington, D.C. Look, I think now's a great time, and I intend to do this, to re-engage with the Russia story and to find out where Russia is. I think that there's a misconception, and I'm sure if the viewer was in Russia in the 90s, that Russia is this super powerful, extremely capable manipulator of the world. It's not. It's much weaker. It's much more nuanced. And I think now is a great time to do that. PBS gives me the space to do that. The other networks, let's see. It's a big world. They have limited bandwidth for nuanced storytelling.
We have a few more. I'm gonna reel them out. This is an interesting one. I think you've touched on it, but your view would be appreciated. Again, from Bill, Donald Trump and Black Lives Matter are both media creations. The conflict and drama generated by both have been great for ratings, And given that, how much responsibility for the divisive hyper-partisanship we've fallen can be laid at the feet of media?
How much can we blame the media for Donald Trump and Black Lives Matter?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more about the conflict and drama generated and the sensationalism around hyper partisanship.
Yeah.
And how much of that can be blamed on the media?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I just feel like this is one of those where we could go on forever. I feel like, the media is a convenient scapegoat. I'm not so sure that the media is to blame for everything in the hyperpartisanship out there. Maybe people have just gotten lazy. I mean, when I'm back for example, in the US, so I was just there, and, I was perhaps unsurprisingly surprised at how partisan people's views about the pandemic were. Mm-hmm. And, I kind of felt like, people just need to kind of just read more. Maybe we live in a more challenging world where the onus isn't really on the people to blame. Maybe it's not the media, maybe it's the consumer that just wants that quick fix of, oh, here's what's going on in 5 minutes. We live in a much more complicated world where you gotta look at a couple of different, you gotta read in, as we say as journalists. You gotta know what's going on, and you gotta know about it from more than one source. I'm not smart enough to figure out, if the media is to blame for all of this. I heard Obama the other day talking about how, it's a big part of it, but some of this stuff started and I'd have to agree with him there. Like, he talked about Sarah Palin was a thing, and sort of this partisan and conservative kind of sort of different way of looking at the world started predated the explosion of social media. So I think maybe we just need to look at ourselves probably a little bit more.
I think it's a really good point, just that it can be easy to blame the media. And yes, they do have a lot of power and influence. And that's, I think, unquestioned. That's true. And we all have our individual responsibility. And we can't
But if we go back to our earlier point, right, Rick? I mean, journalists have a lot less power, right? People have the power now, because they have the power to listen or not to listen. And there's every view out there, and you can, whether it's on Sirius, your one talk show, or people go out there and listen to what they want to listen to. And
or they make news with their iPhone, video recording something on the street, right?
Yeah.
And so that's happening right there, where you're getting the power that way of just getting to broadcast what you see and feel and experience.
Yeah, I mean, look, it goes down to any industry that there's some perils of democratization of anything. There are always downsides, and I think what's happening right now is, as we all have mobile phones. We all journalists of some sort. I remember 5 years ago, there's this whole sort of message to the younger generation that you're empowered. You need to go out and go cover the news in your district, in your local area. If you're upset about the rubbish collection, you're a journalist. You have a voice. And I think that movement has some merit, but I think it's been diluted. And of course, people are using very, very clever techniques on social media to be at the top of the list, to have these headlines, keywords. People are training other people on publicizing information that is probably inaccurate and certainly not researched. Unfortunately,
so maybe we're onto something. Maybe the takeaway of this conversation, one of them could be, we've just gotten a bit lazy. I was talking about how we often retweet stories that we haven't read ourselves. What about retweeting the story that you haven't read yourself that happens to be 7 years old? I'm guilty of that. And it's because we're lazy. You sit down, you get your news in 30 seconds. Oh, that's what's happened in the world. It used to be you had to sit there for 30 minutes, or you had to read
the whole newspaper.
Father, right? Used to read the Sunday New York Times. Pissed everybody off on the planet. The man disappeared for 7 hours, but he actually engaged with the news, and it was it took a day, but he kind of, I think, it wasn't the 7 minutes that we spend today.
Yeah.
Right.
What do you read when you wake up? So take your journalist hat off for a second. Given what you know, What is your source of, what do you pick up and say, right, this must be closer to the truth or whatever, hard fact base? Is it The Economist? Is it something else? What's your go-to reading?
So I do a little bit of I was describing the bankers and how they get their news. I do a little bit of that incremental stuff.
Yeah.
So I spend a few minutes literally on Twitter, and I try and avoid reading Facebook for news, because that's just that's just now crazy, right? So I'll do a little bit of that to see if I'm surprised, but I find that to usually be like, noisy and not very refreshing. Then I'll look at, the usual suspects. I like to read business news. So my sort of alma mater. So I'll check out like Bloomberg.com. I'll check out the New York Times. I'll check out the Wall Street Journal. I'll check out the Times. I'll check out maybe the Telegraph, maybe. I have my Google News alerts, so I use it I have like a Russia alert. Mm-hmm. So every day I get like all the stories about Russia. I've got so I don't really have any huge loyalty to. I kind of sample around. I love to listen to NPR. I love to read, because I think we don't get enough of it. Conservative opinion, right? And just because I don't feel like necessarily hearing it all of the time around me. I guess hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. I like to read Russian news sources, because I follow Russia. There's a lot there, surprisingly, for many. I think there are a lot of independent, they're niche, but there are independent news organizations in Russia. I find them to be very, very educational.
Let's go into the future a bit. So, Ryan, if someone were starting your career again in today's world, what would your advice be for them?
Go somewhere where someone isn't doing a proper job at covering the story, and start telling it and sell that story.
That's the best way in. So look at where the opportunities are and do better.
That's how I did it in 1995, right? I mean, Russia was like what did they call it? It was a hardship post, yeah. And so there were like so I just went in and made people coffee. I was like it was a big story because it was so chaotic, and so I was like in charge of drivers and translating. I had all kinds of random jobs. But because there was more work than there were reporters, I was okay. Whereas, I think you'll find if you go to Washington, D.C., the per capita, reporter to story is much higher. So I wouldn't do that. I would go to where, find a story you want to tell, go there and start telling it. And then, that's how you get to learn the trade and then move from there. Journalism school, I don't know. I don't know how useful that is.
So just on the ground, real experience.
That's what I would
chances.
Say. I mean, it used to be two paths, right? Like for broadcast news, you would either do what I did, which is, go in and sort of go up the totem pole, or you would go to a local TV station in a small market with a small audience in, I don't know, Oklahoma. And then you go to another market, a little bit market. And so, but you would start as like an anchor and move to larger markets and eventually, become, I don't know, Anderson Cooper of a big, national market. Whereas, I was like I said, I was literally in charge of drivers for a good chunk of time. I was the voice of Boris Yeltsin on CNN for a little while. I was a coffee boy. I was microphone holder.
Right.
And, eventually, begrudgingly, the people standing above me let me do a little bit more, particularly when they had to.
Okay.
So I happened to be in places where there was no one else, and I ended up on TV.
We have a question from Toralf, and it's an interesting one. He says, why is Julian Assange getting so little support from the mainstream media?
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, I have a lot of Russian oligarch friends who wonder the same thing, which we can have a more involved conversation about sometime. I don't get the whole Julian Assange thing. I mean, I don't know. Look, there is clearly a place for people revealing I'm sure there's something I'm missing here, but there's clearly a place in this world for divulging information which is not already available to us. Taking classified information, taking stolen information and putting it out there. I'm not saying that that's a terrible thing, right? But it's not the kind of journalism that I normally think of as journalism. And so I don't know. I mean, what should we, Julian Assange, he's made a lot of stuff. He's put a lot of stuff out into the public space. Good on him for doing that. Is he a good journalist? I don't know. He's a good data collector and distributor.
Right. Yeah. And I wonder if what's behind the question, and I don't know, Taralf, but I'm just surmising what might be behind the question is this hunger that we all have for realness and truth.
Yeah.
Right. And I think we're in a landscape.
Hiding something.
Yeah. It's like we're in a landscape where there's so many narratives that are getting spun, and depending on if you're left or right or whatever you are, that it's rare to actually feel like we're getting the real data. And so I think when we can feel like we get that unfiltered, and I'm not suggesting that it's ethical to do that when you're breaking into people's emails, of course, that kind of thing. But the point is more, I think that's what we're starving for is realness on this planet.
Yeah.
Because it's almost extinct.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe some of that has to do with what I was talking about with like original on the ground reporting. We need more of that, more looking at issues instead of talking about how people are arguing about issues.
I think, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I think we're coming to a conclusion where, gosh, there are a lot of questions. I don't think we can answer them all today or ask you those today. But I think we're coming to a conclusion in terms of the future, which is that in past episodes, we've seen a lot of our guests tell us to turn the TV off. So we've said, what should we do? It's getting too much. It's so negative.
I don't agree with that.
Well, that's one perspective. Mark Devine, one of our guests who's a Navy SEAL, said, just turn it off and focus on what you think is important. And, there's a spiritual aspect to it. There's a piece around building, more sort of positivity in your life. That's one element. The other is, I think you're also saying that we need to be a little bit more, we need to take ownership of the input that's coming in from the various channels, the devices or the websites or even the newspapers or magazines or audio, whatever whether you like the written word or you like to listen to the audio or the video. I think we need to be more aware and take more responsibility around what we think is good information versus bad information, or however we want to describe it. I'm taking that away from the conversation today, and I don't think we complain about it often, all of us, and we're like, oh my God, it's getting too much. But how much responsibility do we take to say, I'm not going to go down that path, and I'm going to turn off a social media channel. I'm not going to say Twitter or Facebook, whatever it may be, but I'm going to stop going down that path because it's not helping me deal with trying to work out what's really going on in the world. And I really do feel bad for a lot of true journalists, and I still respect them, because I used to enjoy that. What you described to be journalism in the past is what I relate to journalism as being, because it's that objective view of what's going on, and without saying, well, I hate you, and being judgmental about the outcome. So wonderful to hear that. Rick, would love to have you back on the show, by the way. But Rick, why don't we bring this to a close and some final comments from you and from Ryan.
Yeah, I just want to say to Ryan, thank you again for your candor and just your experience and stories. Would love to get even more deeper in some of those actual experiences and trenches you've been in, maybe next time. But where can people find out more about you and your work? Where should they go?
Sure. So LinkedIn, Ryan Chilcote, that's a place I communicate. I report occasionally for the PBS NewsHour, so you can go on to their website. I don't tweet so much anymore just because it's noisy, and I do other things. I in addition to my reporting. So I think I got a website, ryanchilcote.co.uk. But yeah, those are a few spots where you can keep up with me.
Okay, so you're hearing that, audience. If you're interested in more of Ryan's point of view and what his work, and also if you're a journalist and you want to learn more about the field, please go to those websites, ryanchilcote.co.uk. Yeah. Okay. Thank you again, Ryan, for being on our show today.
Thank you very much. I wish I could have had sort of better answers.
Hey, I think they were great. And let me just share this really quick for our show next week. Oops. Messed that up. Here we go. It's actually going to be the first time since the very first episode that's just Rick and Af. No special guests next week. We're going to be unveiling our new Maverick Leaders program. And it's basically a summary of all that we've learned this last year. And it's our way of giving back to you. And so it's going to be some coursework that's free and available to the public about what does it really take to be the leader that we need to be in a post-COVID world, from all the things that we've learned from our amazing guests this whole year on Straight Talk Live. So stay tuned for that. Next week, we'll be talking much more about our Maverick Leaders program. And all of you.
Week after next, Rick? Is that week next?
Oh, you're right. Sorry. Right? Next week is Thanksgiving in the US, so we're taking next week off. Thank you for that. So this will be the following week. It's going to be December 3rd. So 3rd of December, Maverick Leaders program. Stay tuned. Ryan, thank you again for being part of Straight Talk Live.
That was very enjoyable. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thank you so much.